Hi, and I hope this finds you well wherever you are in the world. My name's Kate Beerworth. I'm an Australian sports and exercise physio, and thanks very much to Bow Performance for the invitation today for this really exciting female athlete mini-series. I'm currently the Australian women's cricket team physio and SSSM co-ordinator, and prior to that I have a background in football, as in soccer for the Americans on the line, and was the Australian women's team physio for over 10 years. So what I'm going to present to you today is a lot of personal experience. I'm not a researcher, but I will present some research around this space in terms of what current injury prevention strategies are out there, some concepts which is constantly evolving in the world of injury prevention, and certainly in its application to female sport and female athletes. So as we all know, the female athletes' popularity and professionalism is in the world space is really improving, and there's certainly been a very strong rise in women's sport over the last few years. And March the 8th, 2020 will be quite a historic day for a number of reasons. It was the final of the ICC T20 Women's World Cup in Melbourne here in Australia, and there was a record crowd of over 86,000 people that night, of which was the highest attended standalone women's fixture here in Australia, and the second highest in the world, behind the 1999 FIFA Women's World Cup final in the US. So it will also go down in history as the highest, I think, sporting event, our highest populated sporting event in terms of attendance for 2020, as the coronavirus pandemic really took hold later that week. So it was quite an extraordinary day, and really showcased what female athletes are about at this stage. So there's certainly an increased professionalism around women's sports. There is increased pay, there is increased money, and with that comes the ongoing commentary around the gender pay gap, not only from the athletes. So this was a historic pay deal last year that the Australian women's team forged with their federation in some equal footing with men, which is fantastic for the elite level. But as that headline says, it's really about the devil in the detail. What does that mean for support in the grassroots sort of sector, and how we can help kind of build the game and increase participation and maintain participation so that the talent pool remains strong, and what does that mean for the funding behind the scenes in terms of not only of the elite players but the support structures around them that sustain those leagues and those competitions. And Megan Rapinoe has really been at the forefront of leading this in the US, and certainly used their successful World Cup campaign last year in 2019 to be an advocate in this space and really lead the way. And as we know, there's some interesting, for those that follow this space, there's been some interesting handings down lately in the US courts. And then the next phase will be, what does the equality look like in terms of the pay structures around and the support structures around facilities and medical staff, which is really, it is in fact quite a prominent part of injury prevention, and one of the pillars that we need to look at. So whilst we look at the rise at the elite level, we really need to see what's happening at the grassroots level if we're really serious about implementing some of these injury prevention strategies and concepts across the board for our female athletes. So how can we make it safer, make it, these performances really be the highlight of these outstanding athletes as the rise continues? What we don't want to see is the high dropout rate of adolescent females due to injury, the fear of injury. We want headlines like Sam Kerr doing a backflip, scoring an unbelievable header, as opposed to the scenes that we often see in the media around female athletes of should they be playing, is it safe? And this is a photo of an Australian Australian female footballer, Erin Phillips, who has also played for Australia in basketball and represented Australia at the Olympics, and has played in the WNBA. And so what should have been a historic day for female sport in Australia, at that stage it was the highest attended standalone game of 53,000 people here in Adelaide, which is where I'm from. The headline was about Erin Phillips doing her ACL and the running commentary around, is it, should girls be playing a high speed, high contact game like Australian rules football? And so our job as sports and exercise medicine professionals in this space is to really advocate on not should they be doing it, but how can we make it safer? And are there methods and are there strategies around what we can put in place to make it a safer place? And there is certainly a lot of research in some regards in female sport in terms of particularly around the ACL, but often they're lumped in with male cohorts. So there's a recent systematic review with a meta-analysis from Alicia Montalvo, and really that's looking at what the rates are in football, so in terms of soccer, with the same exposure as males, and it's it's almost double. So we know that there is a certain risk. So we know that that's a risk factor for playing a change of direction, field-based sport, court-based sport, like basketball, netball, football, and certainly Australian rules football. So what we want to see is that we have an increased growth in participation. We have increased pathways so that players can see that they can go on and sustain a great career, and that they don't drop out of sport with that fear of injury, which is often the commentary around female athletes. So what other structures can we put in place to make that safe and make that happen? So if we go back nearly 30 years, the Van Mechelen model of injury prevention is if you've read the injury prevention literature, is really where it all started, and in terms of actually assessing what is the problem, what are the big rocks in a particular cohort. And historically it's been all lumped together, and it's been football, hamstring is the most common, ACL comes with the most burden. But really, to understand your sport and to understand the female cohorts, we need to really drill down on establishing the extent of the injury problem there in step one. What is the incidence? What is the severity for females for that particular sport? Because it's not as simple as just pulling the data that we have from male community athletes as opposed to adolescent males. Adolescent females are very different cohort again. And elite female athletes are very different again, and depending on the sport. And so really it's important when you're reading research and you're taking in all this information is to really bear at the front of your mind that it is very context specific, not only for sport but gender as well. So we have a good example in the ACL case in female sports. And it has been, these steps have been, largely written about infinitum in the literature. But female athletes, working with female athletes and trying to implement some risk reduction strategies does create there is some challenges around there, because we know that there is a lack of research apart from a few areas. There is a lack of injury surveillance. So how can we identify those big rocks if there is very little reported in terms of injury surveillance for a particular sport? We know within sports that there's a lack of gender-specific protocols, and there certainly is a lack of normative data in female cohorts. And so collaboration with some great researchers, and you'll hear from Tyler this week and on the panel on later in the week. But in terms of normative data, it's really important that we collect that, and sports work with researchers to come up with some clinically relevant ways of doing that, and some ideas that we can then work together to try and build a picture to identify those rocks and see what our normals are. The other challenge for female athlete risk reduction strategies is the physiological difference in that hormonal influence. And there's certainly been lots of commentary in social media and the media globally around menstrual tracking in female athletes, which is starting to become more commonplace, which is fantastic. And any kind of thing that we can do to learn more about the complexities of injury and performance is really important. But we also have to acknowledge and be aware that we've got to be very careful about doing the sexy stuff if we're not doing the basics well. And what we do know works well, particularly in the ACL case, is some of those primary prevention programs that target all, which I'll just go into shortly. This is some principles of epidemiology that have been around for many, many years. So 60 years or so, we've known about primary and secondary prevention and tertiary prevention in public health, and there has been some great kind of concepts and modelling in terms of into the injury prevention in the sports medicine space over recent years. So what we'll talk about just briefly in terms of how can we target, how can we get our best bang for our buck, and that's really look at primary prevention strategies, which is really addressing all of those people in that space and in that sport. And we'll go through, what secondary and tertiary prevention means later on. But largely, primary prevention is really there to prevent the first episode and that first biological event, which, as we know, and if we take the ACL as an example, can then lead to, it's got a high burden and it leads to significant consequence down the track and significant effects in terms of knee joint and long-term health. So our universal interventions that we really want to think about when we're talking about strategies are sleep, nutrition, workload management, things that apply to across the board to male and female athletes and personnel. So your particular staff, your particular athletes is really, it comes into that sort of universal, intervention of injury prevention. Have we got the right people on the bus, and are we doing the basics well to then start to sort of drill down into some more selective interventions depending on your sport. So if you're working with female athletes, we know that ACL injuries are high for field-based and court-based sports. So selective interventions for all, you would be looking towards injury risk reduction programs. If your cohort has a high incidence of hamstring injury, you may look at some eccentric strength parameters. It's really about those sport-specific readiness. It might be protective equipment. So I currently work in cricket. We have helmets, which is fairly standardised, but not implemented across the board. In Australian cricket, we have neck protectors, which has been developed and significant resources as the result of a catastrophic injury in Australian cricket where a player died as a result of a blow to the neck. But in developing those neck protectors, it's largely around the male game. We need to then consider, the differences in the female game, neck size and so forth as well. So when we're looking at all these things, we really need to consider the differences in males to females and not just apply, have a one-size-fits-all approach. And we really need to think about exactly what your cohort is. So when we look at the evidence-based injury risk reduction programs, these have been very well published. And hopefully, if you all have an interest in female athletes, which is why you're tuning in, a lot of these programs will be very familiar to you. So the Swedish Football Federation, in partnership with some great researchers in Sweden, have come up with the knee control one of the original programs in terms of neuromuscular training programs to prevent injury, the PEP program out of Santa Monica in the States, the 11 plus kids. Footy First is a program that was based largely on a lot of those principles of a neuromuscular training program and strength-based training program that's been validated to community males. Again, we can't then transfer that across to a female cohort. So knee control, PEP, the 11 plus kids certainly has a female cohort, and you can drill down on that. More recently, some fantastic work out of the University of Calgary with the iSprint program, looking at implementing these types of neuromuscular and strength training programs to junior high school athletes, with a significant reduction, particularly in the females. So whilst a lot of it is sport specific, some general programs like iSprint is certainly worth looking into if that's the space that you are interested in. And also we've got more recently, again, some outstanding work from the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Centre in a shoulder injury prevention program looking at throwing athletes, of which there is a number of females in that cohort. So, and there's some great resources on their website there, which is the Skade-free website. So apologies to the Norwegians for my pronunciation. So we know that there are, we know that these programs work. We know that there's a significant reduction in lower limb injuries. More recently, earlier this year, Kay Crosley and her fantastic crew from La Trobe in Melbourne here in Australia are doing some fantastic work, particularly around the AFL, so the Australian rules for women. And this meta-analysis that has been published, which is open access on BJSM, really drills down into female-specific variables and looking at, what programs look at, single risk factors, and what that will tell us is that multi-component exercise-based programs seem to be the most effective. And certainly, once we drill it all down and look at that, we know that we can reduce ACL risk of up to a half. So that's well established, which is fantastic news. So if you work in female sport and these programs are new to you, you'd be thinking this is the absolute golden ticket. We have the vaccine, if you like, for ACL injuries. But the reality is that in the real world, we still have them. We will still continue to have them. And so why are the stats not as good in reality as they are in these RCTs? So what we know is that these programs struggle in the real world, and translating, as we all have struggled with at times, I'm sure, is how do we really get that knowledge translation from the research into reality. And so again, I'm borrowing the work of some great researchers in this space here, but we know that a lack of facilities, a lack of resources, leadership and knowledge, so if we don't know about it, you can't implement it. Time is always a pressure, and certainly when coaches don't have access to athletes a lot, they really want to be working on their skill development, and there's compliance issues from both coaches and players alike in regards to it's too boring, it's too hard, it's too difficult. So what does that look like then in the female space? Well, if we have if we take the context of female sport, often we have inexperienced staff, and largely that's due to pay driven. Often the equivalent female SSSM support staff may be voluntary. It certainly may be a significant pay disparity to their male counterparts. So often you've got young physios, young strength and conditioners that may not have the knowledge and the education around the fact that these primary intervention programs exist. Often there's scheduling changes too. So if we're, and again, coming down to cost, There may be a much higher, congestion of fixtures in female sports because they've really got to try and cut down on accommodation costs for some of these leagues or travel costs. So there are lots of other confounding variables that make some of these things quite challenging in the female space. You may have staff that are not experienced in female athletes and so don't actually understand that there is a real need for a different application of neuromuscular training and the differences that go involved with that, let alone all the other psychological and coaching support that may need. So we know that exists, and so a couple of strategies just to consider in regards to successful implication. It's really important that you create buy-in, and as I said before, context is the key. Know your sport, and if you don't have the data in regards to injury surveillance, make some connections, start to do some basic injury surveillance yourself. But really, this is where globally we can connect to see what else is out there, and often someone may be doing some great things in this space. It's really important to address the barriers, of which I just mentioned a few. It is really important that we sell the message well. So prevention is not sexy. We do not know what we're going to prevent. And we know time and time again from feedback from athletes and coaches and in the research that prevention doesn't sell, but performance, winning trophies, doing personal bests, being available to train and work on their craft really does sell. I'll talk a little bit about being careful around your language of that, and this whole concept of improving athlete availability and having them on the park or on the court for longer is really a shared responsibility. It shouldn't fall in the domain of the physio or the strength and conditioning coach. It's really a collective, and there really needs to be shared education around that and around what are the big rocks and what are you trying to achieve. So creating a buy-in is really helpful to tell a story, and as we all know, a picture tells 1,000 words. And so in my time in football, certainly we had a significant number of ACL injuries over the time. In Australia, women's football was growing. We had players that would make the national team at 16 years of age, which simply does not happen in a male sport where the talent pool is bigger. So we know from ACL injuries that if you have an ACL under the age of 20, you are more likely to go on and have subsequent injuries. We also know it's when the peak incidence of ACL injuries occur. So being able to use real people and real stories, and then highlight pictures like this where the red circle is one ACL injury, the blue is 2, is then to talk to the coaches and talk to the power brokers of the sport in regards to what that means then for a restraint of technical ability, tactical ability when you take a player in their formative years, or when they're certainly hitting their stride at an international level, and you take them out of the scene for at least 12 months. We know, return to play is not return to the perform. So when you can hit them at their hip pocket, if you like, in terms of really striking a chord, and it may be very different for each and every one of you in the sport that you work in, but being able to create a narrative is really important, particularly when you are trying to create change, of which when you're doing these types of things at an organisational, it does need to be organisational. It needs to be wider scale. The top-down approach is much more effective than trying to do it from the bottom. And so by changing some thought processes around the organisation and around the key leaders in that, you're able to affect some change and see some buy-in. Just going back to language, it's really important that you do be careful with what you say. So historically, yes, it's been called injury prevention. We call it injury risk reduction. if you implement an injury prevention program and a player does their ACL, you've lost the player, you've lost the coach, because they will think, if you've, depending on how you've portrayed the story, if you kind of say, we're going to do this injury prevention and it will do X, Y, and Z, the minute you have one, it does almost sort of create a rod for your own back. So being really careful and being really particular in regards to changing your language to the performance angle. It certainly has. Being available on the pitch has significant performance impacts, and we know that from lots of outstanding work from the UEFA group in men's football, but certainly in other cohorts, athletics and so forth. That being available certainly improves your ability to work on your craft and to perform. So a couple of tips: gradual implementation of programs like these injury reduction programs, not that you're going to call it that, performance enhancing programs with your coaches and your players. Try and just do it little by little bit. Certainly find a champion within your group. You may well be the champion in your organisation, but finding an athlete, and it may be an athlete that's had a personal experience of a previous injury, if it's you're trying to reduce your throwing injuries, if they've had a long-term shoulder problem. There is often stories of players ending careers because of significant injuries. So being able to personalise it and find that champion that can help drive it so that it's sustainable within your cohort is really important. And just remembering not to worry about it being perfect, and trying to make it fun, and lots of exercises in those programs that I showed you are partner and paired and can be implemented with some slight variation. I just want to highlight some really outstanding work of Matt Whalen, who's a colleague here in Australia. Whilst it's in male football, it's in sub-elite football, and they had a cohort of over 1,000 players, and by listening to the end users and listening to what the barriers were in terms of too boring, too time poor, and worrying about fatigue from doing exercises like a Nordic hamstring prior to training, they did some great work in terms of rescheduling the strength component of the warm-up, which is the 11 plus, into later into the program or afterwards, and there was a significantly higher percentage of compliance, lower incidence of hamstring injuries, which we know in the male cohort is really important, and a significant number of ACL injuries. Now, bearing in mind this is in males, and I know that I've just said that we can't compare apples with oranges. However, it is a really great example of how we can use context of the literature in terms of addressing barriers and then putting some real practical solutions in place for the real world. And ideally, this type of research would then be replicated in the female, and it's really important to get stakeholders, organisations, university collaborations to make this happen, because, as I said before, we know resourcing in female sports is often really minimal, so it's hard to do all those things on a very small budget. So there's some really huge scope for collaboration with others. So we've talked about primary prevention, and really as I said, a vaccine approach, a blanket approach for all. There's conjecture in the literature. Can you predict who will go on to be injured and who won't? My advice would be use a blanket approach to some of these things like ACL injury prevention, performance enhancing programs, I should say, rather than really sort of targeting specific groups. This is some really useful work, I think, to then take the next step in terms of looking at how then we can further evolve our strategies around reducing injury risk, looking at secondary prevention and looking at tertiary prevention. So secondary prevention really discusses around what is preclinical, so before they present with symptoms. So there may be some biological change. We know that structure doesn't always equal, change in structure doesn't always equal pain or loss of function. So really implementing some measures around early detection and early treatment prior to those symptoms appearing. Because what we're really trying to do is prevent people being, once they're in that tertiary stage where they have injury, they will never go back to that pre sort of injured state. So if we get them at that early detection, then hopefully that we can manage that with a few interventions and a few strategies, and we can keep them on the park without it then developing into a significant injury which requires time lost from the sport. So Martin Wallen has done an outstanding amount of work, and again an Australian colleague who's done some great things in men's football at the Australian Institute of Sport. And really, I would encourage people to look at this systems approach and the prevention continuum that Martin published last year in BJSM regarding sort of groin and hamstring injury. But you can apply these things to whatever injury happens to be the big rock in your sport. And so if I look at the sport that I'm in currently with in female cricket, certainly throwing injuries and shoulder pain is an issue. So applying some of these post-match monitoring methods into our systems to monitor, see if there is any decrease in strength, decrease in their internal rotation, shoulder range. Can we do an intervention? It might be load management, it might be some manual therapy, it might be further recovery strategies, whatever that might be. Can you intervene? Can you change that? When you retest that, have you made an acceptable change that comes within your risk management thing? Okay, yeah, I'm happy for that player to continue in that forum, and depending on the context of the situation. So this is where baseline screening, pre-season screening can have a role to play. We know that there's not a static score that you are, absolutely driven by, but it just helps. The more you collect data and observe it and measure it, then we can look at how we can improve that going forward and how we can detect them before they become symptomatic and before they come into a clinical phase, which may result in a removal of play or removal of training or modification of training. So if that's an area where you think you'd like to learn more, I'd really encourage you to look at Martin's work, and I think we will look to see some exciting things in the time where that's been applied into other cohorts. In regards to that tertiary phase, once someone has gone on and sustained pathology, whether it's an ACL injury, whether they've had an ACL reconstruction, then our tertiary prevention really shifts to ongoing monitoring, ongoing testing. And this is where, we have to look outside the scope of, basic strength testing. We need to look at functional testing. Where are the remaining deficits and how can we restore those and maintain those? And particularly we know with ACLs and particularly in females, quad strength is a great example that, they have to constantly keep working on that. So if you only measure that at the time of return to play, but don't do that periodically afterwards, then their gradual function may decrease over time. So that's an ongoing part of injury prevention. Athletes will have a much different and much probably better motivation than if they are asymptomatic. So sometimes buy-in at that tertiary level is a lot greater. You can use people that are in that tertiary level to try and help be your champions, but we need to think and apply some injury prevention principles across the board as a continuum, rather than just thinking, okay, how do we prevent the first one? Fantastic. That is going to get our best bang for our buck. It's going to affect the most people. But then, and certainly once you are working in elite sport, often then you spend a bit more time in that secondary and tertiary phase, but at the same time, we should all still be drivers in that primary phase. So I will finish now, and I really thank you for listening if you've hung in there till the end. Selwyn gave me 20 minutes. I think I've gone a lot longer than that. So I think there is so much to unpack in this female athlete space, and it's super exciting. I think there is a really strong need for education of stakeholders, people making the decisions of organisations, of the importance of gender specificity. We shouldn't just apply what we know in the male context to females. And great examples of that is coaching curriculums. If there is no sort of gender specificity within them, then how can we go about trying to change that? Because there is a multiple number of complexities that need to be considered. We need to improve our structured approach to data collection. Injury surveillance really does drive the discussions of injury prevention. As I said, some SSSM input, and as the pathway for female sports grows, we will have increased experience, I think, increased avenues and pathways for not only the athletes but for SSSM practitioners who work in that female space. As historically we've had, I think across the board, a lot of people use it see it as a leapfrog to male sport, and I see it certainly very differently to that. Having worked with some pretty amazing athletes over a number of years and been very fortunate in that space. Remember to be careful about using the term prevention when you're discussing it with stakeholders and with coaches. We need to really go beyond implementing the simple prevention strategies. We actually need to do the basics really well, though. So let's not get too focused on the buzz of menstrual tracking. Whilst I'm not saying we don't need to look at that, we absolutely do, but let's make sure that we're implementing what we know works. And really crucially, and forums like this, and I've been really lucky to work with some great researchers to be able to help build some of those ideas around normative data and so forth. And so Matt Braun and Tyler have done a great job in the normative data that they've collected that they're presenting to you this week. We really need to work together as sports, and with tech companies like Vowed, who have been a great supporter of female athletes over my time in sports. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the panel on Friday.